Okay, so there was a slurry wall, a 3-foot thick impermeable wall constructed around the containment area, anchored into bedrock. Bedrock ranges from about 10 to 40 feet at the site. So we've got that slurry wall that was built with a temporary cap. And then under the DEP, Olin piloted extraction of a material we refer to as DAPL, DAPL, which stands for a dense aqueous phase liquid. So it's this mixture of chemicals that's sort of dissolved in the groundwater, but it's heavier than water, so it sinks down to the bottom, and the DAPL material is pooled in these bowls, depressions in the bedrock. The containment area cap was constructed. These are some photos that some of us took out at the site this past year. So that's what the temporary cap looks like if you were to walk onto the site today. And then in terms of the history of the site, once it was transferred from the state program to the EPA, the federal cleanup program, the Olin site was listed on the federal list of cleanup sites, the National Priorities List, the NPL, in 2006. Then EPA entered into an order with Olin, and in 2007, investigations began under EPA oversight. And now for the purposes of studying the site, we've subdivided it into 3 areas for study, one being the soils on the property, sediments and surface water on the property, and off property as well, and of course groundwater. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jim to go over the findings from the remedial investigation efforts at the site.
All right, good evening. My name is Jim DiLorenzo. I'm also an EPA project manager under the Superfund program. I've worked on this particular project since it was listed on the Superfund list in 2006. And I'm going to take 12 years of investigation and narrow it down to 8 slides. So I'm going to try really hard to hit only the important points. Something to be aware of is that, as Melanie mentioned, there was an order here. So the first thing we did when the site was included on the Superfund was to sit down and negotiate with Olin Corporation and other previous owners and operators so that they would pay for and conduct the investigation. And so that's all this work that we've done to date has been under what we call an administrative order, where Olin hires the consultants and EPA, with our own consultants, oversee that work. You're also very fortunate in this town to have people from the Wilmington Environmental Restoration Committee who've also been reviewing the documents very closely as we've moved through the project. And the town of Wilmington itself has retained GeoInsight, another consulting firm, to oversee everything. So there's been a lot of eyes on this investigation, is the point I want to make. This is the basic main points of the study. As Melanie mentioned, was basically divided into soil. And for soil, we had this is the 50-acre Olin property outlined in orange. This is Ames Way. This is Main Street here. And here is the MBTA commuter rail corridor. And basically, even though the overall property is 50 acres, the former manufacturing activities were limited to the 30 acres to the north. The 20 acres to the south was put into a conservation easement through an agreement between Olin and the town of Wilmington prior to the site being added to the EPA list. But we did study all 50 acres. We focused the investigation on these 30 acres for soil, and then we did also characterize soil down in here. And basically what we found is what one would expect. There is a lot of residual soil contamination in this area, and this was relatively clean. I'll go into that in a moment. But we also looked at sediment and surface water, both on the property. On the property, we have the South Ditch Stream, which actually drained some of the waste from the former manufacturing operations, and that flows into what we call the East Ditch Stream, which flows from north to south down into Woburn. So this South Ditch Stream flows into the East Ditch Stream, and then they both flow down to the south. We also looked at North Pond over in here. Didn't really find a direct hydraulic connection, but it was suspect and close enough that we did investigate the North Pond and did not find much going on there, fortunately. We also looked at Landfill Brook, which is down south of the City of Woburn's closed municipal landfill. And then we looked at Maple Meadow Brook and Sawmill Brook, which are up in the Maple Meadow Brook wetland complex. So those are basically all the surface water and sediment areas we looked at. There's also a west ditch stream over in here that we looked at that's not on the list. But by far and large, the most complicated part of this investigation and the most complicated part of the cleanup is going to be the extent of groundwater contamination. And basically so here's the property again, 50 acres. And the study has taken us out basically to this red dashed line. This is basically the extent of the impacts, roughly 3/4 of a mile to a mile to the north and west. Over in this area where there's a gigantic question mark, we're still investigating that area. We had a hit of one of the chemicals show up over in here, and we need to bracket that now to make sure we delineate the full extent in the northern area. But other than that, these other boundaries are well defined now. Some of the issues are, as Melanie mentioned, we have something called DAPL, dense aqueous phase liquid. These are basically chemicals that when they were released from the lagoons, they were denser than groundwater, and so they sunk to the bottom of the sand aquifer, and they pooled on top of bedrock in natural depressions and seeped into some of the bedrock fractures. And so the dense aqueous phase liquid, and I'll show you where those pools are in a moment, is one of the most significant issues out here. Come back. Wow. Wow. Holy moly. What happened? Jeff. Wow. I'm sorry. The other issues are that there's both overburden and bedrock groundwater. So the overburden refers to the sand aquifer, which is basically from the ground surface down to the top of bedrock, which here is roughly 40 feet, give or take. And then in the bedrock itself, there are fractures, and those fractures, some of them are conductors, and they move groundwater and contamination. Thank you, Jeff. You're welcome. Yeah, my VCR works fine. I'm not a technically savvy person. My apologies. And so I'm going to back up a slide. And so, there's overburden in bedrock groundwater, and then there's also an issue called vapor intrusion, which some people may have heard of. Some chemicals, when they sit in the ground, create vapors, and those vapors can move up into buildings. It's very similar to radon gas, which I think most people have heard of, except radon comes from naturally decaying rock. There is a phenomenon where you can get hazardous chemicals moving up from the ground into buildings through what we call vapor intrusion. Fortunately, at this site, that's a very limited issue. Most of our chemicals are not volatile. It's limited to on the site, but I'll get into that a little more in a moment. So the soil findings. In order to speak of the soil findings, I want to point out that, again, this is the South Stream ditch. Everything to the south is relatively clean, and that's now conservation land. There is a landfill that was created here from the former lagoons prior to the site being placed on the Superfund list. That was closed under the state, and it's monitored currently through groundwater monitoring. Other than that, this property is relatively forested and unimpacted. To the north is where we have all of the issues in soil. The yellow lines indicate where we broke the soil study into what we call exposure areas. That gives us a way to quantitate potential exposure risk to human health by breaking the site into these sub-areas. So that's what the yellow lines are. But basically, we densely sampled all of the soil throughout this area except for the containment area. What we found in the former manufacturing area is that there's residual soil contamination throughout. Generally okay for commercial reuse. We need to, we're still looking at that. But the chemicals that we found most frequently in soil are trimethylpentenes. Those are your volatile chemicals. Then is this even working? And then this 2-ethylphthalate or BEHP, N-nitrosyldiphenolamine or NDPA. That's different than the main chemical in groundwater, which is NDMA. Polyaromatic hydrocarbons, basically oils, formaldehyde, and chromium. So those are the chemicals that were most frequently detected in soil, but we sampled for a couple of hundred different individual chemicals, and those are what shook out as most problematic. There's also up in this area here, right in here, something we call LNAPL, what we call a light non-aqueous phase liquid. It's basically oil that was floating on top of groundwater. And that was a problem that goes back to the 80s, and Olin had put in a treatment plant to begin pumping that LNAPL out in 1989, and that treatment plant still continues to operate today. It's removed a significant volume of the LNAPL, but there is a small sheen that still remains, and so that plant continues to operate. Also in that area, we have the trimethylpentenes and the bis-2-ethylphthalate in groundwater that's being captured by that treatment plant. This area, these circles in red, are basically areas where we have elevated trimethylpentenes, so here and over and here. In the containment area, we hadn't well characterized that area. There's reason to believe that there could be high concentrations of chromium and other chemicals in there, so that's going to be sampled shortly. And there may be some high chromium out in here. We're still trying to look at that. But basically, the bottom line for the former manufacturing area is there's residual soil contamination. When Lynn comes up, she'll talk about some of the alternatives we're going to look at to address that. Next, the sediment and surface water. And again, we have sediment and surface water both on the property and off the property. On the property, the most significant impacts are in what we call the South Ditch Stream. Again, that used to drain some of the former lagoons, or receive overflow anyway from some of the former lagoons. And parts of it were cleaned up under the state program, but due to contaminated groundwater discharging in these areas where you see the red circles, it's become recontaminated, and primarily with elevated chromium and the bis-ethylhexylphthalate. There's an area of sediments down in the delta of the, this here is a blowout from this area down in the delta of the south and east ditches. That area sediment has high chromium and BEHP, and that needs to be cleaned up and remediated. And then you'll see basically a long circle all the way up and down East Ditch. And there's a question mark as to how much contamination may be flowing into East Ditch. Right now, it's being captured by the treatment plant that Olin has operating. But if that plant were to be shut off, that could be a problem for the East Ditch. And so there are options, cleanup options, looking at that as well. But and then off-site, we did look at the Maple Meadow Brook area. We looked at the Sawmill Brook, Maple Meadow Brook. On the other side, we looked at North Pond, and there weren't really any immediate impacts in those surface water bodies, but we're going to continue to look at them. But the biggest problems are in the South and East Ditch streams on site. With regard to groundwater, again, groundwater is the most complicated issue. It has the greatest impacts. There are these three dense aqueous phase liquid pools. They're kind of shown by the darker green. Here's the Olin property. These pools move to the north and west off-site. And then the overall plume, which is defined by the N-nitrosyldimethylamine, dictates the full extent of groundwater contamination, which goes out into the Maple Meadow Brook. Again, there's a question mark in this area as to how far it may go in that area. And again, this is overburdened groundwater we're looking at. There's more contamination down in the bedrock as well. Other contaminants of concern other than NDMA include arsenic, chromium, iron, and manganese, but NDMA by far is the most toxic and most mobile in groundwater. Again, Melanie mentioned the slurry wall. We'll continue to evaluate the effectiveness of that. But basically, there are, we know enough about the surface water, the overburden, to develop cleanup options. We're going to continue to look at the bedrock, and Lynn's going to talk about the cleanup alternatives in a minute for the overburdened groundwater. This is another way to look at the DAPL pools. Again, here is the Olin property. This is that containment area and slurry wall that Melanie mentioned, and these green lines outline the DAPL pools. So these are where you have high concentrations of NDMA, chromium, and other chemicals sitting on top of the bedrock. So these are the three main pools. This red dot indicates a pilot test well that Olin put in 2012, and they've basically been extracting DAPL from this one pool since 2012. That pilot test well was put in because, unlike regular groundwater, you can't just pump the heck out of DAPL. The physical properties of DAPL don't let you do that. You have to pump it very slowly, and so they've been pumping on this very slowly since 2012, and they've removed about 1 million gallons from this one pool. Overall, we estimate about 20 million gallons of DAPL in these three pools. And so this is a vial of DAPL. Don't run out and get some. This is actually a clear glass vial. And so DAPL has a very distinct dark green color, which helps us evaluate it when we pump it. Right now, they're currently pumping at 1/4 gallon per minute. So again, this stuff has to be pumped very slowly. And they've removed about 1 million gallons. It's pumped from Jewel Drive in an underground well through a pipeline to a 8,500 gallon storage tank on Olin's property. And from there, it's shipped somewhere out west by truck. And another important aspect of this study has been private well testing. We first required Olin to begin quarterly private well testing in 2009. Prior to that, they had done some sporadic testing, but had never really seen any real issues. In 2009, when they went out, we did find NDMA and nitrosodimethylamine in several private wells, particularly on Cook Ave. That led to a more widespread effort to identify all the private wells within the study area around, which basically was around Cook Ave, Border Ave, down into North Woburn, on the other side over on Chestnut, Hillside Way, Mill Road. We looked for private wells in all those areas, and we came up with about 25 private wells that were identified. NDMA was detected at least once in 18 of those wells. The concentrations were very low, and really it's only a persistent issue in 2 wells on Cook Ave. And even there, they haven't really, there's no federal or state guideline for NDMA. There's no regulatory cleanup limit for NDMA. So we look at the risk exposure and try to calculate what a safe level is. It's a carcinogen. So you look at what the cancer risk might be if someone were to continue to drink the water. And a trigger level would be around 37 nanograms per liter. Nanograms a very small amount, so this stuff is pretty toxic. We've been above that 3 times in total since 2009. In each case, though, when we went above it, Olin went back out and immediately resampled, and the level was back down. So we haven't had any sustained hits above our trigger level, but we do have relatively persistent concentrations in 2 wells on Cook Ave. And so with that, Lynn's going to talk about our cleanup plan for all these media. So thank you for your patience.
So this won't work if I use it this way? But I can't use the pointer. All right. Good evening. My name is Lynn Jennings. I'm the section chief of the Massachusetts Superfund section at EPA. My responsibility is all NPL sites in Massachusetts. And I would like to present tonight the cleanup alternatives that we're looking at or considering right now. I will say this is just a snapshot. We're in the process of developing these alternatives and running them through a very detailed analysis When we are done with that, we will actually be publishing some pretty dense reports explaining what I'm about to give you a thumbnail on in a lot more detail, including how we evaluate each of these alternatives. And when we complete that, which we hope to do by the end of this calendar year, we'll be back to actually tell you which of the alternatives we're picking for the various areas of concern. And we will issue that in a formal document. We'll come here again and explain it in more detail, give you a chance to ask more questions, and actually open it up for a comment period. So I did want to just kind of qualify what I'm about to present as being very simple explanations for the types of things that we're looking at to address the issues that Jim and Melanie have talked about. So basically, the site is pretty complicated. There are many aspects to what needs to the cleanup itself. So we basically have organized the alternatives around 6 basic areas or issues that we're trying to address, many of which were stated by Jim in his presentation. The first area of concern or issue we're trying to address has to do with these TMPs that are in soil. Secondly, we're going to look at a variety of alternatives to deal with the containment area. Third, we're looking at specific alternatives to deal with this light aqueous phase liquid, the NAPL, near Plant B. Fourth, we're looking at a variety of alternatives to deal with the surface water, the soils, and the sediments associated with these 2 streams on site, the east and south ditch. We're looking at a variety of alternatives for the dense aqueous phase liquids. And then also, we're starting, this is the first attempt at basically targeting the groundwater cleanup. The groundwater is very, very complicated out here. We have learned enough, we believe, to actually get started on the cleanup. So we're creating a range of alternatives to get started. It is by no means the final remedy that we'll be picking for cleanup, but it gives us a start. So let me start. I'm going to walk through each of these areas and run through rather quickly, the alternatives, just to give you a flavor for where we are right now in our evaluation. So with respect to the trimethylpentenes, this slide actually shows the 3 areas on the site where the TMPs are elevated and actually could cause an issue, depending on the future use of this site. TMPs are very volatile, as Jim said, and what could happen is if a building was constructed on the property, these TMPs could actually migrate into the building and cause an exposure issue to people working, in the building on the property. So this is one issue that needs to be addressed, depending on the future use of the site. We have, okay, I'm sorry, this gives you 2 slides up here. So for this issue, we're actually looking at a range of 5 different alternatives. The first alternative is called no action. We are required by law for everything that we do to look at a baseline alternative called the no action alternative. The purpose for that is we're supposed to document what would happen at the site if we took no action. And then we compare all other alternatives to the no action alternative. So you'll see for each area of interest or concern, we always have a no action alternative. That does not mean that's what we're picking. It's usually a baseline for us to consider all other alternatives against. The next alternative is we're calling a limited action. And what you'll notice as I walk through each of these, as I walk down the list in each area, the alternatives get more complicated or more active and more aggressive. And again, we look at a range and we'll evaluate various aspects of each alternative within this range. So the limited action alternative is basically taking action in the future. What we would do in this situation is if a building wasn't constructed on the site, we could install vapor barriers or some type of sub-slab depressurization system to keep the volatile compounds from entering the building. So that's kind of a minimal option for addressing these TMPs in soil. They would remain on the site, but we could engineer around it through the way we construct the buildings. The next alternative is called air sparging soil vapor extraction. And in this alternative, we're getting a little bit more aggressive. This is an in situ technology. We would actually aggressively try to remove the TMPs that are in the soil. And under this alternative, the way it happens is we basically install wells, we eject air into the ground that causes the TMPs to volatilize. We capture the air, we treat it, and we do this until the TMPs are no longer present in the soil. The fourth alternative is also an in situ technique, a little bit more aggressive. It's called in situ thermal treatment. And in this case, we're actually injecting steam, and the higher temperature steam also works to aggressively cause the contaminants to volatilize. We then capture them through extraction wells and treat the emissions until the TMPs are gone. And the last alternative is what we call a dig and haul, which is basically an excavation alternative. We would go in and dig out the soils to depth where these TMPs are located, remove them, and take them off-site. So that's the range of alternatives for dealing with the TMPs in soil. Okay, next up, I'd like to talk about the containment area. Now, as Jim noted earlier, let's see if I can work this thing too. Chew gum and talk at the same time. So this is the containment area over here. The containment area actually has a combination of contaminated soil, the DAPL material. There is a pool of DAPL right beneath this area, as well as contaminated groundwater. The alternatives I'm going to describe right now are really focused only on the soil. I'll explain some additional alternatives that will focus on DAPL and groundwater later in the presentation. So with respect to the soil, there are two issues that soil causes. First of all, the remaining contaminants that are here, and let me back up a little bit, as I think either Melanie or Jim mentioned, this containment area was actually constructed by Olin years ago when they were doing the cleanup under the state program. It consists of soils and contaminated soils from the other areas of the site, the lagoons that were placed here. And it's currently, as I think Melanie explained, surrounded by a slurry wall, which is like a concrete foundation, and covered with a cap. And there were pictures earlier in the presentation of that cap. It's a pretty thin membrane right now. It was intended to be a temporary cap. So the goal with trying to address this particular area is to prevent the contaminants that are stored in here from leaching into the groundwater and or from people coming into contact with those soils. And there's a couple of ways we can address that. Again, we get the no action alternative as a baseline. The other alternative is basically to upgrade the cap system that's here. This is a temporary cap. We would basically upgrade this to a more permanent impermeable cap with multiple soil layers associated with it. It enhances the drainage off of the area. When this was originally built, it was built with what we call an equalization window. This is a window that was built around the foundation to keep the pressure of water inside the system stable. We would actually close that window up because it is actually acting as a conduit for contamination to come out of there. The groundwater, once it's contaminated, can migrate out of that area. We would find another ways to actually equalize the pressure within this area and make it more tight, if you will. So that would be option 2. And option 3 would basically be to go in and remove the contaminated soils that are in there. I'm going to go to the next slide for a second. This is just an estimate of the soils that we would have to target for removal in this area. This is based on some preliminary data that we have right now. We're in the next few months going to be drilling into this area more aggressively to evaluate the full extent, and that will give us better estimates of the amount of soil that we would need to take out of there if we were to take on this particular alternative. So 3 alternatives to deal with the containment area, and that's strictly just the soil. Okay, next I'll move on to the light non-aqueous phase liquids. Again, as Jim pointed out, this area is located right up here. And also, as Jim stated, this LNAPL material has been undergoing remediation for several years now. Currently, there are 3 extraction wells that are pumping in this area, and it pulls up the water and oil together. The LNAPL is an oily material that floats on the top, and the oil and water are actually treated in this plant B. So the options that we're looking at really have to do with, shall we continue doing what we're doing right now, or are there ways to improve this LNAPL recovery system. A few of the alternatives that I'm going to present in a moment deal only with just removing the oil. And then some of them actually deal with both the oil and the groundwater. The bottom line, the issue, we do have to address both oil and groundwater in this area, and there's a couple of ways we can do it. So I'm going to talk about a few here, but then I'm going to talk again later about other ways of managing groundwater. The real issue is that it's discharging into this stream right here that we call East Ditch. So the purpose is to basically stop it from discharging into East Ditch. So we have for this issue or category, we looked at actually we're looking at 6 different alternatives. Again, no action is the baseline alternative. And then the next alternative, a little bit more aggressive, where we would shut down the existing extraction wells that are operating right now, including Plant B, and we would switch to a manual recovery of this oil material. The way that would be done is by using this substance called absorbent socks that would be placed down in the wells, and as the water is passing through this area, the absorbent socks would absorb the oil. We'd pull the socks out and change them periodically. So this alternative 2 only deals with the oily substance. It doesn't deal with the groundwater that's also discharging into the brook. Alternative 3 is similar in that it only deals with the oil, but it does it in a different way. It would involve the installation of 3 new recovery wells. And the way those recovery wells would operate is they have skimmer systems that would skim the oil off the water, and that oil would be removed and disposed of off-site. Okay, alternative 4, this is called a multi-phase extraction approach, and again, a little bit more aggressive. In this situation, what we would do is we'd install 3 new wells that would basically capture 3 different things. It would capture the oil, it would also capture the groundwater, and it would also capture the vapors, and treat all 3 of those things. It would be sent to the existing treatment system of Plant B. Alternative 5 and 6 take a different approach. And the reason being is one of the things that we learned through our investigation is a lot of the residual LNAPL that remains on the property is actually located under Plant B. It's located in this area. So while we could install wells out here and continue to extract and try to take an approach that gets the oil when it's moving towards the ditch, another option is to go where the majority of the waste still remains, and that's unfortunately underneath Plant B. So this alternative basically looks at taking down Plant B and installing 5 new installing 5 new extraction wells. Again, these are multi-phase extraction wells in the heart of where the residual LNAPL is located. Extracting that, and we'd be constructing a new treatment system in the vicinity of Plant B, and that system would treat, again, it would treat the oily material, the groundwater, and the vapors that were coming off these wells. The last alternative, alternative 6, again, a little bit more, I'm saying aggressive, but it's a different way of approaching it. Again, it would involve the destruction of Plant B, and in this alternative, we would actually go down and excavate down to where the LNAPL material is located and remove it and take it off-site. This alternative, although it gets at the LNAPL, we still would have residual groundwater contamination that would be discharging into the ditch. But again, I'm going to talk about other alternatives that could deal with that in a minute. So, right now I'm going to talk about it. So moving on, I want to talk about the alternatives that we're looking at for dealing with the surface water issues associated with the East Ditch Stream and the South Ditch Stream. And that figure shows exactly where they're located. The issue that we're trying to address with the alternatives I'm about to present is we know we have contaminated groundwater flowing towards those ditches from the center of the site. In fact, groundwater at this site flows radially, kind of flows in almost all the directions. But we do know that they actually, it discharges into both of these ditches, and the concentrations are such that it presents an ecological risk to the organisms that are in both the ditches. So the goal would be to stop that discharge at levels that pose a problem. Excuse me, give me a second. So we have a number of alternatives that we're looking at for addressing this issue. Again, we start with the baseline of no action. And then the next alternative is actually called the limited action alternative. This is primarily a monitoring alternative. The reason being is we're going to be taking some additional actions to address groundwater and DAPL separately, which are the sources of this contamination in the ditch. So one option is address the DAPL material, address the groundwater separately, monitor the surface water to see if it results in success. If it doesn't, we know we have to take additional action. The next alternative for dealing with this issue, again, a little bit more aggressive. This one involves actively extracting groundwater from along the two ditches. So there would be a series of extraction wells installed along the ditch, east ditch, and over here by south ditch. This is the area where we believe the majority of the contaminated groundwater is infiltrating the ditches. This groundwater would be pumped to a treatment plant that would be located up here by Plant B, and that new treatment plant I talked about earlier, and treated before discharged. So you can kind of see it might be possible to combine one of the LNAPL alternatives that take care of the oil. Whoops, I keep doing that. I'm a menace with this stuff. You could combine one of the alternatives that deal with the LNAPL up here with a more aggressive alternative that deals with the rest of the groundwater in the ditch. So before, when I was saying, we could combine alternatives to get to the end goal, that's one example of how that could happen. So this is another alternative for dealing with the same issue. We're calling this, basically a targeted groundwater extraction approach. So in this alternative, what we're basically doing is we're assuming that Plant B continues to operate, or some other technology up here continues to capture both the LNAPL and groundwater, which is the primary source of contamination in this ditch. And we would supplement that with another set of extraction wells over here to deal with what's going into South Ditch. And this would, again, be pumped over to a treatment plant and treated over by Plant B. So putting a couple of different alternatives together to come up with an endpoint that we're looking for. Continuing on, we have two more alternatives using an entirely different technology, but the same goal in mind. For alternative 5, it's called a permeable reactive barrier. And what this is basically a wall that's installed underground that has made up of a certain material such that when the water passes through it, the contaminants absorb onto the wall, and then when the water comes through and discharges into the stream, it's no longer a problem. So we would install a permeable reactive barrier wall along East Ditch, and then at key points along South Ditch where we know the groundwater seems to be discharging. This alternative also involves these couple of sheet piles. These basically act as funnels to direct the groundwater into these permeable reactive barriers before it discharges into the ditch. And the last alternative, again, is more targeted approach, assuming something else is going on up here to deal with groundwater in this area. We would target a permeable reactive barrier wall to deal with the South Ditch, coupled with a sheet pile funnel system. Next, I want to talk about soil and sediments associated with the streams in this area south of the site. Jim alluded to the fact that we know we have some surface soils that contain elevated levels of chromium and phthalates. Not only are they in the soil, they're also in the sediment associated with South Ditch primarily. And we're looking at, there's really only a couple of alternatives for dealing with this issue. We have our baseline alternative, but the only real effective way of dealing with this would be to basically dig up this soil, stabilize it, and dispose of it appropriately. This is a figure that actually shows the sediments that would have to be removed from South Ditch. So it's a combination. It's the same technique, excavating it, stabilizing it, and disposing of it. Okay, almost to the end here. The next set of alternatives deals with this dapple material that everybody's alluded to. This is one of the largest sources of contamination on the site. This is one of the primary things that caused much of the groundwater contamination that we need to address. And again, we're looking at a range of alternatives for dealing with the dapple. And first of all, we have the baseline, no action. And then for each of the 3 pools, Jim mentioned there were 3 pools on the site, and I'll show you a figure of those in a moment. There's one in the containment area that's on site. So we're looking at a range of alternatives ranging from anywhere from 2 to 4 extraction wells that would pump that material out, and it would have to be shipped off site. As Jim mentioned earlier, Olin has been piloting extraction of dapple at one of the pools quite successfully. We've learned a lot from that pilot. We've learned that you have to extract the stuff in a slow manner in order to not disrupt the other groundwater around it. So the issue here, or the goal here, is to try to find the best way to design the extraction system. So the containment area dapple pool would have somewhere between 2 and 4 wells. The Jewel Drive dapple pool would also have somewhere between 2 and 4 wells. And then the Main Street dapple pool, which is the largest of all of them, that would have somewhere between 6 and 12 wells. This is just a figure that shows a rough configuration of how we would go about extracting it. So again, this is the containment area, anywhere from 2 to 4 wells. This is the Jewel Drive area, again, 2 to 4 wells, and then 6 to 12 wells out here. Part of the difficulty with some of this, if you look at another figure, there's actually most of this dapple in this particular area is beneath buildings, is beneath a one big building. So it's going to be, one of the challenges is basically getting under that building. And there's a variety of ways we're looking at doing that. Similarly, depending on what we try to tackle out here, there may be some buildings in the way of where we would ideally want to place a well, but we're looking at a variety of techniques, horizontal wells, vertical, diagonal wells, to try to get at the areas that are contain the deepest amount of contamination. Okay, and the last area of concern I want to talk about is the groundwater. And as I mentioned before, the remedy or the proposed plan we're going to come out with later this year, outlining our cleanup plan, for the groundwater, it's going to be an interim action. We have enough information to know we need to take action, but the extent of that action, we're still having to gather additional information on what the final cleanup plan should be. So we're going to at least get started on what we feel is the worst of the worst. Much like removing the dapple material, we believe that there's highly contaminated groundwater that also we should start extracting and treating. So again, we have a range of alternatives for doing that. We have the baseline, no action. Now, each of these alternatives, as I advance through the slides, you'll see get a little bit more and a little bit more aggressive. We started by trying to target, I said, hotspot groundwater. And there's a variety of ways we can define that. What we did in this cut was to basically, we know the residential tap level water that's safe for tap water is 11 nanograms per liter. That's a very low number. So we took and mapped out the groundwater contamination in varying degrees or multiples of 11. So the most contaminated area is basically above 11,000 nanograms per liter. And this area right here is one area depicted that depicts the 11,000, and then there's another area right here. So our first goal was to say, let's try to target that and see what kind of an alternative would it take to tackle trying to get at the 11,000. And this alternative is one way of doing it. It involves 2 extraction wells, one located right here and one located right here, the ones in blue. And basically we would be extracting from those 2 wells, pumping the water all the way back up. It actually would be going over to the same treatment plant that's located over by Plant B. So this would be a new treatment plant. And so that's one option for targeting the 11,000 contour line. The next option, alternative 3, a little bit more aggressive, involves 3 wells, 2 on this lobe and 1 at the head of this lobe. Again, groundwater is basically flowing in this direction here. So we'd be extracting, the highly contaminated groundwater from those 3 wells, treating it and sending it back to the site for treatment. Groundwater 4, again, a little bit more aggressive, and this time, instead of using the 11,000 contour, we looked at, or what if we tried to capture everything greater than 5,000? And so that would involve, I think it's 6 wells total. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 3 of them in this northern piece, and then 3 of them down in this lower piece. The 5,000 contour is this second line that you can see in pink. The contour lines actually run pretty close together. So that's alternative 4. Alternative 5 is even more aggressive. We'd be targeting this outer 1100 contour line, and for this it would require 12 extraction wells. You can see I don't have to point them all out. All these little blue dots are extraction wells. Again, the water would be collected and pumped back to a treatment plant that's located on the facility. So again, the whole concept behind this is to get the range of alternatives out there, and then we will go through and evaluate each of these alternatives against a number of factors. We'll look at how easy it is to actually implement the alternative. How much is it going to cost? How long will it take? How effective is it over the long term? And we look at all those factors, and then we decide what's the best selection based on balancing all those factors. We will be picking an alternative for each of these areas of concern. So the selected remedy will be multifaceted. I can tell you the most expensive part of this remedy is definitely going to be removing the DAPL and addressing the groundwater. Those are really the 2 critically most important things in this interim remedy, but we'll be addressing all the other aspects as well. So we'll, over between now and the end of this year, and we're, as we speak, we're continuing to create the documents necessary to explain the basis for our decision at the end of the year. So, as I said earlier, at the end of the year, we'll be issuing what we call a proposed plan, as well as a couple of reports that support that proposed plan, and it'll explain, what we think is the best choice for each of these areas and why. I can also say it's quite likely we may even have a few different alternatives added to the mix, because as we've been working on this, we're discovering kind of new things and trying to get it all together in a cohesive manner. So it's quite possible when we come back in December that there's a few other things that we will add to the mix that we've considered. So that concludes my part of the presentation. Next up, I think Melanie's going to go through the schedule and next steps.
Okay, so I'll take us through quickly basically what Lynn just went over, which is our schedule for churning out our plan, our cleanup plan for this interim remedy, this interim cleanup action. So this month and next month, EPA, all the staff at EPA, myself, Jim, Lynn, all of our attorneys, we have a number of technical support folks, hydrologists, risk assessors. We're all madly working together, looking at all of these cleanup alternatives that Lynn went over, so that ultimately we can complete a set of documents that would be the basis for this cleanup plan. So that cleanup plan, our goal right now is to issue it in December by the end of the year. That plan would be issued and be open for public comment and review. It would cover, so what would it cover? It would cover the portions of groundwater that Lynn discussed. So removing that DAPL material, the dense aqueous phase liquid from those bedrock depressions, and removing the most highly contaminated areas of groundwater, what we call the hotspots, the groundwater hotspots. And then in addition, the cleanup plan would also address the areas on and off the property that we've outlined. So the soils, the sediments in the east stream and in the south stream. All of that contamination would be wrapped into that cleanup plan as well. In early 2020, our plan would be, after we receive all the public comments and we have an opportunity to review them and respond, then we would issue the final cleanup plan, which is called the ROD. So again, it would it's not going to be the final cleanup plan for the site. There will be a data gap efforts that will be taken to fill what we see as the remaining gaps in our understanding of the groundwater at the site, the bedrock. So this will be an interim action record of decision. So the ROD gets issued, the interim ROD, then there'll be a negotiation period where EPA's attorneys are in the room with Olin's attorneys, and we negotiate the enforcement instrument, the enforcement document that will oversee, that will provide the framework for actually implementing that cleanup plan. And then in parallel, there will be another investigation phase for the groundwater at the site. So our goals for that would be to improve our understanding of the shape of the bedrock, the fracture systems. There's a lot of unknowns on that, and where the contamination is, how far it's spread out horizontally and vertically, and better understanding of these DAPL pools. That will help us to evaluate our long-term options that are going to be most effective for cleaning up, for addressing the contamination in the groundwater, so that we can ultimately issue a final cleanup plan. And now I will turn it over to some of our partners, stakeholders, and of course, Olin, to make some remarks.
Actually, I only have just a few slides that I wanted to talk about, and this really has to do with the upcoming investigative work that Melanie has and others have indicated in their previous slides so far. So, and I guess part of the reason why I felt it important to kind of talk about this next phase of investigation, number one, I want to say that you have to understand this in parallel with EPA's development and publication of the proposed plan. So that's a very important thing to understand. Like, this is not going to hold that plan up. But there are a lot of important things that we need to understand that will help us proceed with design activities, et cetera. So there's going to be a lot of work being done around town. And so part of this is just to kind of let you know what's about to happen as you see us doing more and more things around the community in the coming months. So this is the areas that we're going to be focusing the next step, the next phase of investigation. Thanks, Jeff. The next phases of investigation. These are really to close what we call data gaps. We've done a lot of investigation so far. We know a lot about the site, but there are still aspects of the site that we need to kind of refine so that we have a better understanding of current conditions. And all of this is just to kind of help us sort of form the underpinning of the evaluation of our alternatives moving forward, as well as being able to develop and design appropriate remedial alternatives. Okay. So so it's a big area, a lot of areas that we're going to be focused on. The data gaps investigation, as I've said so far, will be intended to refine our conceptual site model. That's sort of a technical jargon, right? Conceptual site model is really sort of the basic understanding of the site. What are the current conditions? Like, where is groundwater flowing? Where is it flowing from? You know, how did things get to where they are? So we need to know answers to those questions and be able to refine that model so that we understand how to design things moving forward. And so there'll be a significant effort to do that. We're going to be looking at bedrock topography. There's going to be a lot of work for us around the community and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. We need to make sure that we understand the location and of amount of DAPL. As you've heard Lynn talk about the alternatives that we're evaluating hand in hand with EPA, it's very important for us to kind of know the answers to that, right, obviously. So, and then we're going to be looking at things that will give us a better understanding of the direction and magnitude of groundwater flow across the site as we move forward. So we're going to do this in phases. It's the most efficient way we think of doing this. There's going to be 2 to 3 phases involved. We really are pretty confident that there's going to be 2 phases involved with it. There may be a third depending on what we find, but each phase will inform the next phase. So we'll do phase 1, and we'll get the results of that. We'll get with the EPA and with Mass DEP. We'll look at the results of that, and then we'll determine what the appropriate next steps are for the next phase. Does that make sense? So phase 1 will just be basically what we call geophysical methods. It really will just be outlining bedrock topography, okay? And that has a lot of bearing on how groundwater flows and where things go. So that's of primary interest. It also kind of helps us understand when we go to install additional monitoring wells or extraction wells or whatever they may be, it lets us know where to put them. So that's a very important aspect of all this. The second phase would just be installing all those wells, doing soil borings, putting things in the places where we get the most bang for our buck and we get the information that we feel like we need. The next phase 3, if there's a phase 3, would just be to conduct follow-up activities. If we have any questions left over after the first 2 phases, then we can, tie things up hopefully in a final phase. We're going to use a thing called aerial magnetic surveying, electromagnetic surveying, and what you see basically in this picture is a helicopter carrying a big sensor. And we're going to use this technique to understand bedrock in the Maple Meadowbrook area. So as you drive around town, you know that area is inundated. There's a lot of water in the Maple Meadowbrook wetland right now. So we can't really get out there with our normal tools and try to understand what the bedrock surface looks like. So our consultants have come up with this technology that they've used at other sites and has provided good information. But I specifically put this picture in here because it's going to be a low altitude flyover just over the Maple Meadowbrook area. It's a tongue twister. And so we wanted to make sure that the town was aware and understand that this is part of the process. So when you see a helicopter flying low over Maple Meadowbrook, this is kind of what it's about. But this is going to give us very valuable information, and we can do it very quickly. Like it'll only take a day or 2 to get this done. There's going to be some time for number crunching and trying to understand the results and all that sort of thing. But the actual work is a very quick thing. We can get results pretty fast. So that's very important to us. So aerial electromagnetic survey, it's AEM is the acronym that we use typically for that. And this kind of gives you an understanding. Like, I don't want to get into a lot of the gory details about all this because there's more. We don't have time to go through all the details tonight. But this just gives you a snapshot of what we're talking about. And this is going to happen over the next year. So we're looking at 35,000 linear feet of bedrock topographic assessment, which is a significant amount of work. So you'll see us by the roadsides. You'll see the helicopter flying over. We'll be doing a bunch of stuff on our property that you may not see. But it's all geared to trying understanding what the bedrock topography looks like. So the flight lines for the AEM will be over 250 acres, 100 feet apart or so. So there's going to be a lot of work. We're looking at a range of 24 to 38 additional soil borings around town and within our property. We're looking at installing 26 to 32 additional monitoring wells, 11 direct push sampling locations for groundwater, a bunch of stream gauges. And all of this, I'm presenting ranges of things here, but this is all subject to EPA's approval and oversight. We've drafted a plan after a lot of discussions with the EPA team. We've submitted that plan for their approval, but we want to try and get the proposed plan done first. So, like, once that's finished, then we'll take a big bite out of this this data gaps work plan, get EPA's approval on that in some form. And then we'll go and execute that work. So just wanted you to be aware of what's coming. So the next topic is something that has come up that I know a lot of people are very interested in, and it's a water line on Cook Avenue. We've talked about a couple of houses on Cook Avenue that have persistent detections, fairly low levels, but persistent detections of N-nitrosodimethylamine. We've been providing a couple of houses with bottled water at EPA's request for a few years now as a temporary measure. And the town, your town officials approached EPA and asked them to approach us. And with the idea of installing a permanent water line up Cook Avenue, and we have approval to do that. So Olin is going to work cooperatively with the town and with EPA to get this done. We're still working out the details of that, but I want to kind of present that to everybody and let you know that that is another thing that we're progressing very quickly on, and we look forward to getting that work done in the very near future. So with that, that's all I had to discuss. So I think, who's next? Melanie is.
Thank you and good evening. I think it's noteworthy that I've only worked for the town for 32 years, and yet my whole time here has been involved with this Olin Superfund site, which just goes to show you the challenges that we've had over the years dealing with what has been a very complex Superfund site. Certainly DEP, there were a number of specialists and experts that we worked with over the years early on, and then ultimately when it was determined that the site was at a level that we needed to go to the next level, so to speak, it was declared as a Superfund site, and since then the work has continued essentially I say just, but evaluating the scope of the problem. It's certainly a good place to be this evening that we seem to be perhaps turning the corner to some measure in terms of establishing the scope and level of the problem through the various studies and assessments that have gone on over the last many years. With that said, and it's certainly also good news that we are able to receive a commitment from Olin to make that connection to Cook Ave, at least to bring the water line up to Cook Ave and to make a connection with residents up in that area. One thing I would just note, and it's kind of a separate but related issue, is as you know, there have been discussions over the last number of years about the prospect of reuse of that site. And while it's recognized that part of EPA's mandate, aside from identifying the responsible parties and holding them accountable and fully remediating the site, part of their mandate also is to establish the ability to reuse the property. I would again just strongly encourage both EPA and Olin to wait on redevelopment of that property, certainly until we have the ability to fully understand what is there. It's, in my estimation, far better to have the remediation plan in place and whatever redevelopment happens there at some point in time, work around that remediation instead of vice versa. So I think that's important to note. As was noted earlier, there will be this process going forward and a comment period to ensue. The town officials, as well as our consultant GeoInsight, will pay very close attention to the proposed remediation program and certainly be prepared to offer comments on that plan. And I also would note that we continue as the town, both the Board of Selectmen and the administration, to focus both on protecting residents from exposure to contaminants, removing the contaminants, seeing that the contaminants are removed to the maximum extent possible, and ultimately looking to restore the drinking water supply that we had, the 5 wells that ultimately had to be decommissioned, restoring them at a point in time to a place where they are usable and safe for reuse in the future. As clearly established by the length of time that has been spent on this project, this isn't a sprint, but in my estimation, an ultra-marathon, but we need to be persistent and continue on and work with EPA and Olin to see this to the end. So thank you, and let's hope we can continue to move the ball forward.
Could we key up that mic, please?
Thank you, Martha. Okay, so what we'd like to do now is actually establish a panel to allow people to ask questions. So I'd like to have Melanie and Jim, James come up along with me, and we will field as many questions as we can without getting kicked out of here. I think we do have a hard stop at 9 o'clock. The school would like us out of the building, so if you have a question, yeah, if you could just come down to one of the mics, and
Hello.
I'm going to try to moderate this a little bit.
Hi, good evening. My name is Mike Raymond, and I'm from Woburn, and I represent the Woburn Neighborhood Association and the Aberdeen Study Coalition. And I'm also a member of the Wilmington-Woburn Collaboration. And for the past 20 years, we've been following this along with all of the other environmental issues that surround the area. Our concern, our number one concern, is the East Ditch, okay? And I brought it up to Jim over the past 12 years. I brought it up to the DEP prior to that. The East Ditch itself, with the South Ditch emptying into the East Ditch, and for those of you who are not familiar with the East Ditch, just take a ride over the bridge, look over the bridge onto the railroad tracks. To the left of the railroad tracks, that is the East Ditch. That runs to Woburn, to the New Boston Street Drainway, which empties into the Aberdeen River. Now, what's happening now is there's a $25 million project going on the Aberdeen River. where we're actually cleaning the river and have cleaned the river. And I want to correct one of the faults that I've seen in your presentation tonight, that sediment does travel. Sediment travels, and I don't have a proof to say it travels in the East Ditch, but what I have proof is that it traveled from North Woburn to Medford, and the same sediment was traced from North Woburn to Medford, to the lakes. So we got to be very careful when you monitor the East Ditch for sediment, because what'll happen is that sediment runs along. It'll contaminate all the work that's been done over the past, over the past 20 years. Okay, thank you. And it's not really a question, it's just a statement. And Jim knows I've come to every meeting and I've mentioned the same thing. I go to the same, I mention the same things at the other meetings too on the Woburn side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Sarah Gomez, and I'm a recent resident in North Woburn. So I just heard about this meeting a couple of days ago, and I thought it would be important for me to be here. So many of the things that you said are kind of new to me. What I didn't hear, and I'm curious as a new resident, is what is the range of this contamination, both in the air, both in the water, and what are the consequences for the residents in the nearby communities? Especially I'm interested in the TMP concentrations, since they are very volatile. What is the concentration in the air? What is the standard that should be in the air? And what is the impact? Also, sorry, I have many questions, but I limited this to one more. You mentioned eco-risks of the contamination in the ditches, and I was wondering also if you could mention what wildlife is impacted and how that moves through the chain. Thank you.
You want to take a step?
Sure. So the first question, Jenny, can you put up the figure that has the red outline of the groundwater contamination from my presentation? So the groundwater contamination basically extends from the Olin property itself, which is on Ames Street, to the Maple Meadow Brook aquifer. And that's basically about 3/4 of a mile. So anything beyond that, there's in the overburden groundwater, that's the extent of it. And that's based on the N-nitrosodimethylamine, which is the most mobile chemical. In the bedrock, it can travel further, and we've seen it out on Hill Road, Chestnut, Mill Road, in other places, but it's not that much further. So it's limited in its impact. If you're not living within that area, you're outside of an area of concern with regard to groundwater. With regard to air and vapors, the problem is very limited. The trimethylpentenes are really just located in a couple of areas on Olin's property. And so the concern for vapor intrusion is extremely limited. It's really to future buildings that may be put over those limited areas. So I think that does that answer your questions? Oh, the ecological. Yeah, so the broader impact to air, there is no broader impact to air quality. There are no current exposures that we're aware of. Our biggest concern are the private wells that are active. And as James mentioned, out of all of the private wells we've tested, which are all the ones within the area we could locate, there's really 2 where it's a persistent problem. Concentrations are very low, but it's a persistent problem, and finally some action is going to be taken on that. With regard to ecological impacts, we're really talking about the microbial population in the east and south ditch. And that's where the impacts are occurring right now. So no larger organisms that we're aware of. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Michael McCoy, 11 Treasure Hill Road. Jim, I'm glad to see you here tonight. I'm really glad to see that you're doing well. First of all, I've been on the Board of Selectmen since the 80s, through the 90s, through the present time, so I'm very familiar with the area, Olin Chemical and the whole geographic area. And what I find interesting tonight, I just want to make some commentary, then I have a question at the very end. What I find interesting tonight is I see many of the slides saying cleanup alternatives under consideration. So that tells me we're way off until we actually see some significant change on that property. And I'll address that in a second. We truly need remediation before we can allow any kind of development. Not one building should go on that property until Olin meets its obligation to the citizens of this community and actually remediate that whole thing. You know, I've been involved a long time, and back then we had to shut down 5 of our 9 drinking wells, our aquifers. They were perhaps one of our greatest natural resources. We used to sell water to another community. That doesn't happen anymore, folks. We're at the mercy of the MWRA now. We have no choice in that matter. So that pretty much of that contaminated site, and the plume is still moving on a daily basis. Let's not kid ourselves. Because of that, we cannot control our own destiny. We could control our destiny back then when it came to our water supply. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. We're really depending on big brother, big sister here at the federal government to really step up to the plate and really work with the town. We need this. This is perhaps one of the most serious things, if not the serious thing, that happened to the town. I remember, and I think Jennings, I believe, is your last name. I didn't have the notes. And I asked you a question. It was a difficult question, and I think you had to answer it. I don't want to put words in people's mouths. But we looked and saw what happened to our next door neighbor in Woburn, down by the Target site. They did the landfill. And I asked you the question, in your professional opinion, what do you think is worse, what happened in Woburn or what's happening here in the town of Wilmington? And I don't want to put words in your mouths, but you said, well, they both have its uniques, but I have to say Wilmington's a little bit worse than, say, Woburn. And I remember you saying that. And that goes to show the significance. And I see the gentleman from Olin, been around this community, just turned 60 years old. I've lived in Wilmington all of those 60 years. So I consider myself a townie, and I care about my community. And it's wonderful that you stepped up to the plate and you did something from Cook Ave, but one of our previous speakers hit the nail on the head. Well, it's about time. You know, we lost those aquifers, not to beat the drum on that. We're never going to get that back. I don't think we'll ever get that back. You know, I hope we could get that back, but that doesn't seem to be in the cards. And I just want to, and the plume is consistently spreading, as we know. And I just got one question. I don't know who can answer that. Maybe the gentleman from Olin can answer that, or whoever. But I'd like to see the gentleman from Olin answer this question. Very basic, simple question. What is our end game in this? That's the only question I want to ask. What is our end game? I think we citizens here in the town deserve an answer, our good neighbors from Woburn. And I got to tell you, and I want to appreciate the citizens out there, Martha Stevenson, Suzanne Sullivan and company, and I apologize not mentioning everyone's name, but if it wasn't for you folks stepping up to the plate, we would have never hired Geo Insight. That's what happens when you've been involved in the community a long time. Going on 30 years, representing my community as a selectman. So history dictates everything. And if we didn't have the good citizens out there, I don't know what would have happened. But that's where we're relying, folks. And sir, I'm not going to be negative and hit the drum, but I think we deserve an answer. What is the end game to the town of Wilmington in this?
I'd like to actually start by addressing a few of these, and then I'll give James a chance to also answer. I do have to say, I know there's been talk about development and all of that, and not letting, having the property be developed before it's cleaned up. And, I think the agency stands behind that. Actually, by law, there can't be anything happening on that property that would interfere with the cleanup. So we really do need to have a good understanding of what it is we're going to be doing out there and where we're going to be doing it. And to the extent something would go there that would interfere with that, it can't happen until the cleanup is done. And that's really important. Actually, again, I've been doing cleanup, Superfund cleanup for 30 years, and I've been doing a lot of it on brownfield sites. And while I understand, we don't want development until the cleanup, oftentimes it's the development that actually accelerates the cleanup, because there's a real interest in trying to get the project to a certain point. Up until this point, I'm not so certain there was that strong of an interest. And I can assure you, and we've done it before, much like we did it right down the street with Woburn, you can actually, make progress on both fronts. I'm not going to speak or say I support any proposed development. I know you all know that there's a developer interested in certain aspects. I don't have any opinion, nor does the agency, on whether it's a good development or a bad development. Our focus is on making sure that development doesn't interfere with what we want to do. And the more we get to understanding what our cleanup plan is, the easier it is for us to identify where it will conflict. I think even a year ago, with the documents that we had a slightly different vision of what the development would look like versus our cleanup plan. And where we stand today, I can actually see more conflicts in what was proposed than what we have right now. There are areas of the site that need cleanup before any development can go in there. There's soil areas, the TMP area I told you about, the containment area. We need to know where the groundwater treatment system is going to go and how it's going to get there. We need to finish the investigations so that we know where wells need to be before anybody can develop that property. And we will continue to stay on that path. I also do feel, again, I've been on this project. Jim's been on it longer, but I started working on it 3 years ago. We've had a couple of years of intense negotiations with Olin and trying to review the technical information. I will say that this project is, next to the Cape that I worked on Joint Base, probably the most complicated set of circumstances. We have a very large team of people from both EPA and the state, lots of technical people. Olin has more recently brought in a larger cadre of experts, and there's a lot of work going on right now to accelerate that cleanup decision. And it's not for lack of not wanting to. I would say since June, it's just a lot of information, and it's very complex. But we are committed to getting to this point of getting the cleanup plan out. It is very, very important, because without that on the street, cleanup isn't going to happen. It's important. We have some study work that we want to pursue, that needs to be pursued to finish understanding some of the complexities, but there's no reason why we can't start cleaning up that site. And I know the agency is committed to doing that. I will say, from my dealings with Olin over the last 4 months or so, I do believe there's a different commitment from Olin, and I don't if Jim wants to speak to what motivated that. One of the things that the agency did, and maybe it played a role here, I don't know, the agency was so concerned about the pace of this site, it got placed on our administrator's special emphasis list. That means the administrator of EPA in DC is personally aware of what's going on with this site. He is briefed frequently. There's a schedule that we have to report to him on. Our goal that we've presented to him is to get the cleanup plan on the street by the end of this calendar year. It's a very, very serious commitment. So I want to just kind of, make you aware that it has been a long time, and I can only imagine the frustration you all feel. But we are very, very committed to making, action happen. It's really important. It's important to start working on cleaning up that groundwater. It's also important to eventually be able to turn this site around, so it doesn't look the way it looks in the pictures right now. It looks more like what's going on in Woburn, where you have, development and not a blight on the community. So I just wanted to.
Mike, thanks for your comments, and thanks for your question. And Martha, thank you for your comments and question. I appreciate both of them. We have been working with EPA, and as we pretty much all know in this room, I think probably the majority of people, Olin purchased this property in 1980, and not long after that, we started investigating the site, and we have taken a lot of actions, as Melanie pointed out in her presentation, to remove sources of contamination on the property. I think all those were important steps and aspects of this whole thing. As far as the current pace, we have been engaged, as EPA presented earlier, in fulfilling our obligations under a consent order, and that consent order requires that we proceed in a certain way, and it's difficult for us to get out of that lane, that process lane. So we more recently understand, and a lot of, as Lynn said, some intense discussions But we've looked at the information that we have. We've taken a very hard look at it with EPA, with Mass DEP, and we believe the information that we have is appropriate for us moving forward. I think we're at a place where we've done enough investigation to be able to inform remedial decisions at this point, and I think that bears out in EPA's plan that we support in providing a proposed plan for remediation in the immediate future. So we think that's a very positive thing. We think that's a very positive outcome. We do feel like progress is being made appropriately, and we are committed to continuing to work with EPA, with the Mass DEP, and with the town to identify the appropriate solutions and a remediation plan for this property so that, as Lynn said, we can get this thing turned around. And you know, we are working hand in hand with EPA. I've got a very large staff of people within Olin, within our consulting firms, that are working hand in hand with EPA and their folks to try and make this goal of EPA's happen, you know, of getting a proposed plan out this year. So we look forward to that, and we think that's a very positive outcome.
Good evening. Gary DePalmer, I live in Wilmington. I'm a little confused on a couple of things you just said. One, what is the EPA's opinion on developing the property? One, I hear you don't want to see it develop until it's clean or to a point where you can develop it. And the other is, let's get it developed so we can push the project along. And all I'm asking is, what is EPA's opinion on developing that property at this time?
All right, so if I can be clear then, our primary goal is the cleanup. That's our responsibility. Under the statute, where, you know, our focus is making sure that site is protective of public health and the environment. That is our responsibility. That's our primary goal. With that said, we've also seen a number of sites that after we've cleaned it up and during our cleanup have gotten redeveloped, and it can go hand in hand. I don't have any opinion on whether the development that's proposed right now is a good development or a bad development. That's not for us to decide. That's for the town to decide. But what I'm saying is it can happen, and sometimes when you know what your end game is, what is it going to be when it's done, it's actually easier to mesh the cleanup with that end game. When you don't know what it's going to be, you're cleaning up to who knows what. But when you know what the end game is, you can actually marry the two together. So our goal, first of all, is to make it safe, and we are assuming that it's safe based on a use of industrial commercial. We don't think this is going to be a residential complex. So that's our goal, is to clean it up to that degree. The groundwater itself is another matter. We need to, you know, that groundwater is still classified as a drinking water aquifer, and right now our goal is to try to clean it up to that. You know, we are looking at alternatives and evaluating, you know, what's the best way to tackle it. So, you know, I'm not going to say, I think, oh, you know, our goal is to redevelop it. That's not our goal. Our goal is to clean it up. To the extent a developer wants to come along and develop it, we'll tell them how they can develop it consistent with our cleanup goals. And we will work cooperatively to work the cleanup into development if necessary. We've done that before. And I think a lot of successes happen. I can list town after town, site after site, where we've had great success, where we've actually married the two together. In other words, we've done the cleanup, we got the cleanup to a certain point, and either a developer has come in or a town has come in and taken it from there. And there's a site we just did a groundbreaking on in Walpole, Mass, where they built a police station and a senior center right on a former mill, highly contaminated with asbestos. And that cleanup was done, and the end point of that site is a productive use for the community. And it's a success. It's a win-win for everybody. So, you know, I'm not saying I have a position on this development. What I'm saying is we need to clean it up, and to the extent it gets developed, you know, after we clean it up or as part of the cleanup, that's a success story for everybody.
Hi, my name is Paul Palazzolo. I'm a resident of Wilmington. I have two questions. One, what is the projected start date and end date to do the project? And the second question is, when you check to find what the standards are that you want met, are these minimum standards or maximum?
So the start date for the project really depends on what you're asking. We're starting. We're still in the investigative mode right now. We're going to propose a cleanup plan, get feedback on that. Once we agree on the cleanup plan, we then move into negotiate an agreement with the company that's doing the cleanup. We move into a design mode, and then we move into an implementation mode. It can take, a number of years. I think for some of this stuff, we probably will try to phase it to get going on certain things we can get going with sooner rather than later. I've seen cleanup go very, very fast. Again, if a developer's interested and there's an interest in developing, I've seen cleanup get accelerated because of that. We haven't laid out the whole schedule for cleanup yet. I think once we get through it picking what our plan is, we'll have a better idea of how long it's going to take us to design it and construct it. So that'll probably, more details on that will come later this year. The second question is, are the standards minimum or maximum? We don't look at it that way. We look at what's necessary to be protective depending upon the end use for the site. It's not a minimum max. It's what's necessary to be protective. Again, and for each of these issues, the cleanup for the soil is different from the cleanup from the groundwater, is different from the cleanup in the surface water and sediments. The standards are different in each of those media. For the soil, we'd be looking at what's protective for that site to be used as either an industrial or commercial use. That's what it was. That's what we believe is reasonable for the future. With respect to the groundwater, it's still classified as drinking water. So right now, our goal in the long term will be to get it back to a drinking water aquifer, unless some study proves that it can't be. Right now, our goal is that. With respect to surface water and sediment, we're looking at what's necessary to protect the ecological environment there. And there's published standards on what level it needs to meet in order to be protective of the microorganisms. There's published standards we'd be shooting for. It's not a minimum max. They're standards that are used for many sites.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Good evening. Representative Robertson, and I'm here with Senator Tarr and Rep. Gordon. And among us out there earlier, we had a few questions I have personally, to which I may be addressed by you, Jim, or Ms. Jennings. And then I have a kind of a hardball question for Olin. As far as the EPA is concerned, will the DEP cancer study that our legislative offices have been flogging DEP for, our peer review phrase is set to be discharged mid-December to early January. Will the results of this study be incorporated, and if there's any correlations or causations found, impact specifically the stream water and the groundwater and drinking water runoff remediation plans? Because I know it's just a working theory right now, but I think a lot of folks in this room would think that a cluster of rare cancers that resulted in the death of the elderly and the young, I don't know. I did decently well in science class. I think there's some sort of connection. So will the EPA be addressing the results of that studies, or at least examining it to see if there's any correlation between?
That's a great question. So I want to highlight a major distinction between regulatory responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So when EPA, so what the Department of Public Health has been looking at for a long time now is that historic releases from Olin or from its predecessor when they were operating the facility, and those contaminants moved into the public water supply, and then from the public water supply was distributed to residents of the town. Did that result in a cancer cluster now forming all these years later? And that's been their study. So they look backwards, whereas EPA, we look at what are the current exposures that are possibly happening out there. Our primary concern at this particular site is the active private wells. But then we base our cleanup on what are the future potential exposures moving forward. To prevent those exposures are what these cleanup options are meant to do, to possibly restore groundwater at some point to a drinking water standard. So the outcome of that study basically won't have any bearing on, our cleanup plan is based on our estimates of future exposure
Sure.
moving forward. And so good or bad, whatever that outcome is, it won't change our course.
Sure. So even if the DPH, their independent study, found some historical doors, so to speak, of where these carcinogenics entered, that will not be included in the EPA?
Well, it wouldn't impact. It's an important finding. Don't
Sure.
get me wrong, but it wouldn't impact what we're doing. We have enough data, enough evidence, enough concern about future exposure that we're moving forward with a cleanup plan.
Okay, so you believe that yours will already encompass what DPH may or may not find?
Correct.
Okay. Second, the thing too, I wanted to ask what the EPA is doing, looking at the broader, particularly the groundwater penetration. There's been a lot of development in the area, particularly just across the line with the removal of bedrock and topsoil. And I know that's going to change the hydraulic kind of release of the groundwater, especially since a lot of that was impermeable material. And has your study been consistently updated to reflect that? This is just for the folks at home watching.
Yeah, I mean, our study, so the hydraulic conditions were very different at the time that the facility was operating. You had, active discharge, and then across the way over at Maple Meadow Brook, you had the 5 municipal wells pumping at 2.5 million gallons per day, pulling things over. And so the study does consider that, but it looks now at the current situation where you don't have any additive discharge and you don't have active pumping, and it considers that hydrology.
Sure.
So it's continually updated, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I see. And then the last thing I wanted to see if Olin, I know, as you said, there's a promise to the community in that. Would you be willing to work with the town or the state to deed restrict the site until, and have the deed under review by the town, so that the town, when they feel that this might be a developable site, then allow the site to be constructed upon? And that way you have, like you said, a promise to the community themselves can make that decision and also have an equal say along with yourselves in the EPA.
If I understand your question, we're proceeding cooperatively with EPA to develop a plan. And I think that plan, whatever EPA identifies as the appropriate remedial alternative, is going to be implemented.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think regardless of the development, discussions that we've had with the developers, they understand that there may be, what's the right way to say it? There may be concessions that they need to make to facilitate the remediation, not vice versa, as Lynn says. So, we're confident that we're going to develop, EPA is going to develop a plan irrespective of what the potential development may be in the future. And we're committed to working with EPA to implement those appropriate solutions.
Sure. But would you be willing to commit to work also with the town so that we feel on the local level, and we trust the EPA. I mean, Mr. Lorenzo, I was there with you in Post Office Square years ago when the previous site plans were described as nothing really more than a napkin scribble that we knew of at this point. And I'll be honest, that understandably scared myself and a lot of folks, my predecessor, the folks in the town, Ms. O'Mahony, Mr. McCoy, Mr. Eaton, the other select board members. So I'm curious, again, it's fine whatever comes between the EPA, and we're throwing our trust with the EPA, and I'm happy to see the administrators bring a national attention to this, but at the end of the day, it should be us in the local area to kind of give our thumbs up here. We do it anyways with our local zoning, and I was curious again if Olin would be able to, or would be willing to, to agree to it and say that we believe before we go forward and propose any development, beyond what you'd have to locally sort through with the zoning and construction permitting, but just basically getting a thumbs up from the 5 elected members of our select board on us saying, yeah, their opinion is that this is now a site appropriate for development. It seems like a promise is a promise, and this is a way to ensure that promise doesn't ever flow, however this may continue developing.
Sure. I mean, what I can say about that is I do believe that the developers have the intention of working cooperatively with the town. I think that we are obviously going to have further discussions with all appropriate stakeholders as we move forward in this process. And I think in the end, this site is the remediation is going to proceed regardless of what the development turns out to be.
but it will proceed to what's the agreed standards between two parties outside the town, from what I understand, with the exception of the local group, who are proud and loud voices, but have a limited influence as opposed to this alternative.
Oh, I'm sorry. And, you know, that's, I think that's what I can say on the issue. Yes, absolutely.
I think I can add something that may be getting at what you're looking at. I mean, one thing, you know, EPA does as standard practice when we have a PRP lead site like this, where the PRP owns the properties, we put what we call a lien on the property, and we do have a lien on this property. That wouldn't prevent development from moving forward, but obviously if EPA weren't satisfied with what the developer were providing, we may not, you know, we have that lien there. And right now we have, I mean, this development's been in the works for a long time prior to EPA coming along. And we recognize that when we placed the lien on the property. And, you know, we would envision receiving the money from the sale of the property for the cleanup if it moves forward. So that would be a condition if it does get redeveloped. But the bottom line is we do have a lien on the property. We intend, it wouldn't prevent redevelopment. Like Lynn said, we work with developers to make sure cleanup is consistent with the development. But we do have that lien if for whatever reason the developer doesn't work with us cooperatively.
Sure, but again, that's preventing, or excuse me, that's not preventing a redevelopment. And what we're trying to get at here is, at the end of the day, we would like them to agree, at least, or explore the possibility of having some sort of local, for lack of a better word, leverage or fail-safe insurance plan here that they can come to the board or a town meeting and get that agreement lifted to then proceed once the general public hears. Because again, I know the EPA and there are local heroes in the local office, but on a federal level too, there was some rollbacks. Now they're dumping coal ash in the rivers and streams, which is leaving a lot of people scratching their heads. So you know, we got to have to look out for ourselves too here in the fight.
Sure. I guess what I'd like to say though, I mean, is like any other piece of property, clean or dirty, let's say it's clean. You know, what I think you're saying is any person that owns a clean piece of property in Wilmington, we'd like to have an agreement with you in the town before you sell it and use it for use that we think is acceptable. And, you know, I don't know that that happens generally for anybody that owns a clean piece of property, you know, in Wilmington or anywhere else. Obviously, there's certain property rights, and I think any developer's going to have to go through the normal channels to get their approvals of what they're doing on the property, and the town has ways of blocking that, ways of blocking the kind of development that happens using their zoning boards to do that effectively. That's no different on a Superfund site or any other site in a community. And again, I'm going tomorrow night to a public meeting in Holbrook, waste transfer station being constructed right next to and on top of the Superfund site down there. And similar issue, the community doesn't want it. And they have to work through the town to, you know, for the zoning to stop it. We can't stop it, you know, and the property owner isn't going to stop it. You know, it's what town politics do. What I think we can offer is that, and it's another thing I wanted to mention on top of what Jim was mentioning is, first of all, making sure the cleanup, you know, is understood, what's necessary to be done to make it safe, making sure that's done to an extent where it doesn't, you know, that any development doesn't interfere with that. And there's one other instrument we will place on the property in addition to the lien. The lien is basically our ability to get our finances back to the extent we spend money and, you know, the site is sold, we get that money to pay ourselves back. We actually also put on the property, and it'll be part of our cleanup plan, it'll be spelled out, an institutional control. And that institutional control is a deed restriction, it's enforceable by the state, and it tells you where you can do things on that site and where you can't. So let's say, for example, you know, we decided the remedy for the containment area was a cap. We'd have a control on that area, that anybody in the future, if they did anything to disrupt that cap, and it came along in the future, we'd be able to enforce against them to fix it. So those are the kinds of things we can do. And I mean, you know, I'm not trying to come to the defense of Olin here, but I'm trying to make this, this situation is no different in terms of the redevelopment and what avenues the town has to control that redevelopment. And I don't know that it's an appropriate thing to say, hey, Olin or anybody else, you can't sell your property until you get buy-in from the, Board of Selectmen.
Sure.
I think you can say, and I think, we're the backstop for, we want to make sure the site's clean for whatever use it has in the future, and that's done appropriately. And I think, the agency, not only the state, the federal agency is there to make sure that happens.
I'll wrap up my point for the folks behind, but I just think if we are promising things, we should have a local control, and the poor guy that's trying to build a deck extension shouldn't have to go through more hoops, because the rumored previous usage allowed some circumvent of state and local ordinances. And it's gone quiet. That always worries me when things go quiet and working behind the scenes. So I think, Mr. Cashman, if all the respect and agreement like that would mean something beyond words to our community. So thank you, everybody.
First of all, I want to thank the EPA for the postcard. I'm new to Wilmington. I've never heard of Olin, and I don't know anything, but my main concern is water flow. What about the drinking water? Is it safe? I don't actually know where the plant is, but I live over in Ballabird by the, in Ballabird Avenue by the North School. And what are you doing to test the water? How safe is the water? This has been going on an awfully long time. So how much exposure do we have to contaminated drinking water?
So let me just quickly answer that. So I'm not certain exactly where your house is located in relationship to the site, but any of the homes that we feel could be impacted are currently being monitored by Olin. So if your house isn't being monitored, where we're routinely coming out and sampling your water, then you personally don't have anything to worry about. You're likely getting your water from the MWRA system, through the water line that's in town. Most of the houses in town are connected to a different water supply provided by the MWRA. So probably after this, if you know where, you could talk to one of us specifically about where your house is located, and we can, give you more specifics about where, where the contamination is.
Okay, thank you. And thanks again for the postcard.
You're welcome.
I'm coming at this at a different angle. I'm Bevan Engelward from MIT. I'm the director of the Superfund Research Program. So this is the research arm of the Superfund program. And one of the concerns that we have is what happens when you start to mix up the soil? What happens when you start to move water? What kinds of sensors do we need? We have people at MIT working on air sensors. They actually published a paper recently, NDMA sensing for air. And this, we hope, might be useful as you progress. We start to move things around. We're going to want to know what's in the air, what's in the water. I worry about the people who are going to be involved in doing the cleanup. Their exposure being near the waste. A lot of issues are going to follow that go beyond just what is our end goal, but rather what's going to happen in the interim.
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent comment. So, as typical at these sites, some of the most biggest concerns regarding exposure occur while we're undertaking the cleanup, because we're in there, we're messing with the contamination, whether we're excavating it, whether we're trying to thermally heat it, and there are a lot of safeguards that are put in place to monitor, to make sure we don't have any uncontrolled releases, both for the workers themselves and also, but more importantly, for the surrounding community. So
I think MIT might have the first and most sensitive test for NDMA in air, which was just published. So that might be a tool that can be brought to bear.
Yeah, that's good to know. I mean, NDMA is not a chemical that EPA typically deals with in the Superfund program, and it's only had a kind of an understanding of the air pathway for the past few years. So it's good to hear that you're developing that.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. I guess I'd like to, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you. I'm State Senator Bruce Tarr, and I want to express my appreciation to all of you for being here tonight and for allowing us to have a very important discussion I am very proud to be part of a 3-person legislative delegation that represents the town, and I'm very honored to have represented it for about 25 years, perhaps not as long as some of the others in the audience, but it's a legacy that I'm very proud of. Having said that, and having been at least an observer of this situation for a long time, I have to tell you that there are many things that I've witnessed tonight that, while I'm appreciative of the information, it leaves me quite unsettled. And so I'm unsettled by the fact that after at least all of the time that I've been involved with the situation, we still have gaps in data, that we still don't have effective models, that we're still trying to understand the location and the topography of bedrock. These are essential things, and on many occasions I've witnessed models where I'm now understanding that those models were at best incomplete. And so I'm deeply concerned about the lack of progress, and I'm also having a hard time getting a grasp of the trajectory of the process thus far. So we've seen a little bit of information, for instance, about some of the contents that have been extracted. It would be very helpful to understand, if we look at the totality of the circumstances, how much progress we've made on a variety of fronts, perhaps by the different contaminants that have been identified tonight. I would suggest that the delay is deeply concerning when we've seen diligent efforts by people in the community, the selectmen that have spoken and many others, Martha's group and many others, and that we ought to take some action to be able to hold some folks accountable for that amount of delay. To wit, if it's a situation where the responsible parties have not been effectively cooperating to get us further than the point that we're at tonight, we ought to consider all of our options for additional liability so that we can garner the resources in any means possible to be able to accelerate the process to make up for lost time. Having said all of that, I am concerned about a conversation at this stage about redevelopment of the property, which I think is premature at best. And when we talk about the fact that the EPA, and I appreciate this, would want the property to be clean, my experience with these type of projects is that there are different levels of clean that are held in the eyes of the beholder. So, for instance, one of the things that I could see the responsible parties pursuing here is a covenant not to sue. And it would seem to me that we should be very reluctant to be able to issue that until we get to a level of cleanliness that we could all agree on. Last but not least, I would hope that there'd be more information forthcoming, and it would be forthcoming in the very near future, and I would hope that we could work together to be able to have discussions, if not in a forum of this nature, then in a forum that might be held as between town officials and the people on the stage and additional folks as well. Along with that, I would encourage the town, and we will be having these discussions, to begin looking at things like zoning overlay districts for this particular piece of property that can limit its use based on its suitability for various uses, and perhaps whether or not we could also modify the current zoning ordinance in town to require a special permit for the reuse of heavily utilized industrial sites such as this one. I think we have a lot to think about. I'm deeply concerned based on what I've heard tonight. But that being said, I'll end where I began and say that I do appreciate the opportunity for us to have this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I'd actually like to respond to a few of the things that you're saying. First of all, I think your idea of working with the town on the zoning issues is excellent. That's exactly where restricting the future use should happen. It shouldn't happen here with EPA stopping it. It should happen in the town, and you have a lot of tools at stake or available to funnel the reuse to be something that you want it to be. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I will say, and I'll be very honest, the delay at this site has been in part due to some difficulties between the relationship between EPA and Olin. That's no secret. I am, and I've worked with a number of responsible parties through my career, and I will say, that there has been a change of heart. I think there's been a change of attitude, and I've seen a lot more resources brought to the site in the last few months since we've been working with them. I am very encouraged by that, but I'm also, like everybody, you're always skeptical. We're going to continue to work with Olin at this point and try to accelerate things and make up for some lost time. I would agree with you. This took way too long. This is the #1 reason why we put it on the administrator's list, 12 years to do an investigation is a long time. But again, I think there's been a corner that's been turned by Olin, and I think we need to seize that right now and focus on coming up with a plan that everybody understands and accepts within the community, for whatever end use it's going to be. We'll make clear what our goals are for cleaning it up, and we'll welcome any feedback. If you think it should be different or you think it should be more, we'll welcome that. That's the next phase. And I also agree, we need to be back here sooner. It's been 5 years, and that's too long. We've been spending a lot of time trying to negotiate, the investigation. I think we're done with that now, and we're on to the next phase of coming up with a cleanup plan. And so I'm very hopeful that things are going to change with first the cleanup plan coming in the fall and actual work, happening. A lot of the investigative work that Olin is actually embarking on will actually help us with the design of this remedy. So although it seems like more study, it's a study with a different focus. So yeah, it's kind of unbelievable to believe we don't know where the bedrock bottom is. We kind of know where it is, but most importantly, we need it a little bit more accurately to figure out exactly where to put those wells. So we're at a different phase, and but I do want to, just thank you for your comments, because I think they're right on. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lee Brooks, and I'm a concerned citizen, neighbor. I do have a question for Olin that I don't think has been answered yet, and I'm excited that you've come around and decided to work with the town and with EPA, but I'd like to know why. What was the change of heart? What caused this change?
Well, as I said before, we have been working with EPA for a long time. We signed a consent order with the EPA that put this project on the Superfund list. We have been working through the process that we are required to work through. There has been a lot of investigation that we've done, and we've spent a lot of time doing that and thinking about this. This is a very complex site, as Lynn said. Having said that, we have had differences of opinion on how to interpret the data that we have, and we've put our thoughts forward. EPA has put their thoughts forward, and there's a lot of smart people on both sides of the table. And we all recognize also that when you have a set of data, you can interpret it a bunch of different ways. Mm-hmm. So I think from our standpoint, it's a situation where we sat around the table, we talked about a lot of this stuff. We spent a lot of time arguing about it, frankly. Mm-hmm. But I think it sort of was an important step for us to go through that process, because we are committed to developing with EPA, and I think very cooperatively with EPA, to develop appropriate solutions for the site. And it was important for us, and still is, to make sure that we're evaluating that data appropriately. This is going to be, as Lynn pointed out, this is going to be a complicated and expensive project. And so we want to make sure we get it right. And EPA has made some very compelling points. We think we've made some compelling points. But when we stand back and look at it, we know that remediation has got to proceed at this project. We know that. And we're at a point where we have a set of data that we agree is appropriate to move forward at this point in time with a remedial plan. And we're here to work cooperatively with the EPA to make sure that that happens.
Okay, and I had one other question. And who are the developers that are interested right now in the property?
The original developer was a company called New England Transrail. They still are in the picture. They partnered with another company out of Boston called GFI Partners. They formed together an incorporation, I think, Wilmington Intermodal. And it's our understanding, based on the discussions that we've had with them, that they've had with EPA, that they've had with the town, that their intent right now is to develop the project with warehousing, for commodity products. So Wilmington Woburn Intermodal, to answer your question.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Just real briefly, Jonathan Eaton, 18 Lawrence Street. I want to thank Ms. Marash, Mr. DiLorenzo, and Ms. Jennings for coming here tonight. Ms. Jennings, when you came in front of the Board of Selectmen about 5 months ago, I know the timeline at that point was the proposed plan was going to be announced in either September or October, and here we are in late October, and now it's been pushed off to December. I do share some of the frustration of others that have spoken here tonight that it is just continuing to be a lengthy process, and I do trust when you say that this has been a very nuanced and difficult project, that is the reason for the delay. If the December, or if it's even later than that, if the proposed plan, when it is eventually released, I would ask that the EPA come back, because a lot of the folks that have come here tonight, I'm sure will have more questions, because a lot of folks are going to still have a lot of questions as they leave here tonight, because we still don't know what the next step is. And a lot of the questions that I think that we're hearing tonight on what the next step, where development is going to happen or what it's going to be, we just don't know. And we're just been waiting. We've been waiting. And I know one of my colleagues got up here and said that we're really depending on you folks at the EPA to protect the natural resource and the land and the groundwater to do the cleanup. That is absolutely true. We are very much dependent on you folks to really advocate for the residents here and that couldn't make it here tonight. So I would echo my colleagues' comments to just impress upon you that please help out this community. It's been an awfully long road, and we know that this has been a difficult project for you guys to study. It's been a very difficult road for a lot of the folks in here tonight. So please, please do what you can to clean up this site. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm batting cleanup or not. It looks like I might not be, but Joe Marie O'Mahony, I'm one of the other Board of Selectmen here tonight. And I just wanted to take a moment to first thank Mr. Hull for his statement earlier about the development of the site and that not being a priority. I agree and echo those sentiments. I appreciate Representative Robertson asking about deed restrictions, because I do think that's something that should be considered at this point to show good faith and corporate responsibility and what's been going on, what continues to go on. And Senator Tarr for talking about zoning overlays and kind of reminding us that as a town we have other options that we can be pursuing to put a pause in that portion of the discussion. But to echo what Selectman Eaton was just asking, we kind of had the timeline, January, February, we have the final plan. And I know we can't say what the end site is because we don't know what the alternatives that are going to be selected. But I guess I would be asking, you know, when are we going to begin? Because when I heard it took 7 years for 1 million gallons of DAPL, and there's 20 million gallons estimated, math was not my strong point, but that's 133 more years with the current plan in place. So my concern is we're talking about, you know, and you call it a restriction of a lien. I see it as an inducement that if we're going to allow a developer to come in with a lien on the property that they'll clean it up, how are we guaranteeing when that cleanup is going to be finalized if it takes 7 years to, at the current rate, to get rid of 1 million gallons of DAPL? So that's a serious concern that I have, that I would want to make sure before we're considering anything that we know when the end is in sight. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear to everybody up there, that that's not just individuals. I think as a community, we're all saying the same thing, and we hope you're hearing it. Thank you.
I'd just like to answer the question a little bit on the time frame. So that 7 years was based on using one well. If you remember in my presentation, we have a much more aggressive approach at trying to, you know, address that DAPL stuff and get it out, you know, quickly. So you know, I think that's the part that 7 years was based on just one well, pumping at a very slow rate, and we agree it needs to be accelerated. Depends on the rate. What I didn't give you on the details on that is how quickly we'd be pumping each of those 6 wells. When we come back in December with a cleanup plan, we'll actually have estimates of the time based on the various designs and estimates of the costs. So you'll have a better understanding for what our projection is for getting the stuff out of the ground.
Hi, Debbie Duggan, resident, identifier of the original NDMA that brought the EPA back in. And the EPA was involved in the site in the beginning. And then legislation changed and DEP took hold of the site, and DEP was handling the site. And DEP and Olin were reporting before our Board of Selectmen for years upon years upon years upon years upon years upon years upon years, talking about basic sodium ammonia chloride that had reached our wells, until we actually saw our cancers go up, as many communities have. Nobody really questioned it.
And it bothered me as a resident not to see our selectmen say, gee, you know, something might be wrong here. You can't just listen to the person that owns the company. Everybody has their own interests. I'm here to say that the town needs to stay involved. It's been a long time and may go into our grandchildren, but the selectmen have to remain involved. The residents have to stay involved as much as they can. Work has been excellent. They have their own consultant. We were luckily able, through the residents, to get the town to get their consultant. And finally, the newspapers aren't arguing that there's not a problem here. There is a problem. It needs to be addressed. I do not want to see Olin get their foot in the door this much and turn that into a transrail station. That's what I'm afraid of, because there are further residents in that area. You can redevelop the site when and if it's worked into the plan, but all eyes have to be on it. The town cannot put their total faith into any other department. The town has to look out for the town. As Olin's looking out for its best interests, I don't know if there was any lesser regulations recently. I originally wrote to President Bill Clinton on this, and Representative Jim Maselli heard back, as well as I did, from the EPA in Washington, D.C. They never should have let this site go. This site was identified and part of the paperwork back in the contamination to those ditches when Woburn had its leukemia with its kids and its contamination. There's no line, there's no wall between cities and towns. We have to all remain involved in it and do the best we can. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'd like again to thank you all for coming tonight and offering your input thus far. Again, this is just the first. We will be back again to present, the interesting part of this, which is our proposed cleanup plan. And I guess that concludes this evening.